Once a respected British institution, the Post Office continues to lurch from scandal to scandal. It remains enmeshed in the Horizon scandal, in which hundreds of sub-postmasters were wrongly prosecuted and had their lives destroyed because of information provided by a faulty IT system. It's been described as one of the biggest miscarriages in justice in British history. And it's now been revealed that between 2008 and 2001, some of the so-called suspects were placed in various groupings which were defined by racist terms. Journalist Nick Wallis wrote The Great Post Office Scandal, which is the definitive account of this story, and he joins me now. Nick, thanks very much for joining me. Nick, could you tell me, before we begin, about this latest revelation, could you tell us about the Great Post Office Scandal? What exactly happened there?
Well, at the turn of the century, the Post Office rolled out a massive IT system called Horizon, which was described at the time as the largest non-military IT system in Europe. Unfortunately, it didn't work. But what it did do was take responsibility for branch accounting, that is, what happens in each individual post office branch, out of the hands of the sub-postmasters who ran that branch and took it into the control of the Post Office. Unfortunately, due to the terms of their contract, the postmasters were legally responsible for the figures that this IT system threw up. And when they were faulty, then the Post Office unfortunately decided it was going to prosecute these people. And many, many hundreds of people got given criminal convictions for fraud-related offences to do with the misappropriation of public money, when in fact it was the computer system that was throwing up dodgy figures.
And why did this take so long to resolve itself?
Because the Post Office covered it up. In 2013, there was unequivocal evidence that there were problems with the Horizon IT system. Independent investigators had gone into it. But the Post Office refused to acknowledge this or admit it for another 6 years, and it had to have the truth dragged out of it, kicking and screaming, in a massive epic litigation at the High Court, which was won by the 555 sub-postmasters who took part in it. And since then, we've had the process of convictions being quashed and the compensation schemes being set up to try and help the poor people who've been left destitute by having criminal records for sometimes more than a decade. And yet that has found itself bogged down in the weeds as well.
Now, this kind of action is usually the kind of thing that people with money, with resources, can handle relatively well. But we're talking about workers at the Post Office who wouldn't have those kind of resources. I mean, can you give us any sense of the kind of impact that this had on these people?
Well, we know that there have been 4 suicides amongst the hundreds of people who were sacked and prosecuted. But this goes even wider than this. There were many, many people who found themselves out of a job. They'd been publicly shamed by having their post office taken away from them. And of course, sub-postmasters are very visible within their communities. They're not rich by any stretch of the imagination. Their earnings have historically been quite poor, but they were so visible. They were well known within their community. And so when they were suddenly sacked in mysterious circumstances or were then charged with theft or false accounting, then of course a community could turn on them. We've heard stories of people's daughters being spat at. We've had people who were beaten up as a result of the shame that they brought on their community. And it was particularly keenly felt in the South Asian community, where it would break families apart, because if a sub-postmaster was sacked or prosecuted, it would bring such a degree of shame on their family and their community that they would often be ostracized, causing all sorts of incredible mental health problems for everyone who suffered like this.
And let's just bring us forward to what's happened now. There's been this scandal exposed at the Post Office of guidance which classified people according to race and used some language which I'm not going to use at this time on this channel, but very offensive, outdated, racist language. How is it the case that they had these documents? How did it happen?
Well, the historical version is that in the late 1970s, racial identification codes were introduced by the police in order to use them over radio. So you would have someone who was white European described as an IC1, and then they would go through the various racial descriptors of people. Now, some of those terms that were used in the late 1970s, now we would say, were wholly offensive. But they were essentially grandfathered in, I think, to the Post Office investigation teams, the people who made the prosecution decisions at the Post Office, because one of the signal things about this scandal, and one of the reasons it remained undetected for so long was because the Post Office had its own investigation team and its own prosecutors. So they effectively bypassed the police and the CPS. But obviously some of these IC codes found their way into the Post Office investigation unit. And in their compliance documents, they were required to racially categorize their suspects. Now, you said this went on till 2008. We don't know when it finished, because the Post Office is currently investigating to find out when this compliance document actually was discontinued. So it may have been a good 2 or 3 years after that as well. And there's no doubt about it that these terms are, in the words of Nish Kumar, Victorian-era steam-powered racism. And when I've studied the Post Office for as long as I have, it's not surprising to me that they would use terms like this, because if your department is responsible for erroneously prosecuting hundreds of people on false evidence, it's hardly any surprise that your compliance systems are going to be in a complete outdated mess. And so but obviously the language itself, if you do read about it, and it's only a short Google away, is very, very offensive to lots of racial groups.
I mean, that's the point. I wouldn't even just say this is outdated language. It's positively 19th century. It's so far outdated that I find it baffling. I can't understand how it could be, how these compliance documents, that no one saw them at any point and thought, oh, well, they're due a bit of revision. How did that not happen?
Well, I guess if you're going back to an organisation, particularly a department within the organisation, which was almost exclusively white, was largely made up of burly ex-coppers who'd made their way over from the Met and didn't think that closely about what they were doing. And that is why so many people were falsely prosecuted on dodgy evidence, because they didn't understand what they were doing. They were not a competent organisation. So it's unsurprising that incompetent people who don't know how to navigate the modern world very well still have the mindset of a 19th century prosecutor and still are using language which wouldn't be out of place in the 19th century.
And just very quickly, before we finish, Nick, now that, you've written your book, this has been covered, the scandal is out there in the open, does the Post Office look like it's going to try and rehabilitate its image anytime soon?
Well, the racial language document is just one of 3 scandals which have broken in the last month. We've had the tax lawyer, Dan Needle, the man who brought down Nadeem Zahawi over his tax affairs, look into this scandal and actually submit a formal complaint to the Solicitors Regulation Authority about the way that one element of the Post Office compensation scheme is being run for victims, because he says it's misleading and the Post Office is either deliberately or misleading its victims, or it's incompetent. And on top of that, we found out that Post Office executives had awarded themselves bonuses just for cooperating with the public inquiry into this scandal, which is their statutory duty. Now, this has happened in the space of 4 weeks. You wonder how the Post Office continues to go about shooting itself in the foot the entire time, and whether it will ever recover. There are people starting to ask serious questions about whether the organisation is fit for purpose at all, because it doesn't have any value to the country anymore.
Nick, I'm sorry, we are out of time, but thank you so much for joining me on the show today. Really appreciate it.